After years of believing his military dog died in combat, a middle-aged veteran stumbles upon him in a local shelter, battered and renamed. The reunion ignites a relentless pursuit for justice, exposing a government network that illegally sold war dogs to private interests. Alongside two fellow veterans and a repentant former mercenary, he fights a system that forgot its own soldiers. As public pressure mounts, the government is forced to respond, triggering change from within. But even as the nation begins to heal, a single truth remains. Some wars don't end when the fighting stops, and some loyalties don't fade when the uniforms come off. The story closes not with triumph, but with silence. Peace, and a porch under the fading light, where a man and his dog finally rest. What came before was war, what came after was choice. Hold on a moment before we move forward. Let us know where in the world you're watching from. And if you're loving these stories, don't forget to hit subscribe. Tomorrow's episode is going to be absolutely mind-blowing. They told him to move on. Get another dog, they said. The war is over. But for John Kramer, the war had never truly ended. Not in his bones, not in his heart, and certainly not in the eyes of the scarred Belgian Malinois sitting behind the steel bars of that shelter cage. It was supposed to be a routine visit, just a recommendation from his VA therapist. Try connecting with animals again, she'd said, scribbling notes without looking at him. But the moment John stepped into that modest shelter on the outskirts of Arlington, Virginia, he felt it. Something wasn't right. And then he saw him. The fluorescent lights flickered above, casting shadows on the concrete floors and chain-link enclosures. The sound of barking echoed like distant artillery fire. John walked past pit bulls with names like Zeus and Rosie, past yapping terriers and trembling hounds, until he stopped cold at Kennel 42B. There, sitting still, quiet and alert, was him. His coat was darker now, streaked with grey. A long, raised scar ran down his left side, angry and pink. His right ear drooped slightly. Injury, maybe. But the eyes hadn't changed. Not one bit. Maxwell, the tag read. But John knew that wasn't right. That wasn't his name. John crouched down, his worn knees cracking in protest. "Aegis?" he whispered. The dog lifted his head, ears forward. The eyes widened. Then came the unmistakable twitch of recognition. And then the whine, low, mournful, alive. John reached through the bars with a hand that still trembled sometimes when holding a glass. "You remember me," he murmured. "Don't you, buddy?" Aegis, no, Maxwell, pressed his muzzle against John's fingers, trembling, and that's when it all came flooding back. 5 years earlier, an ambush in Kandahar, fire everywhere, screams, chaos, the searing pain in his leg, and the last image burned into his memory. Aegis lunging forward to protect the squad, then disappearing into smoke and gunfire. They told him later the dog didn't make it. No remains were recovered, just another casualty of war. And now here he was. A moment later, a shelter worker approached. Her name tag read Linda. She smiled with practiced detachment. "He's been here a month, brought in from a drug bust outside Baltimore. Poor guy's been through a lot. Mean as hell, too." John rose slowly. "That's not Maxwell, that's Aegis. He was my dog. Military K9, Afghanistan. We served together. He saved my life." Linda's smile faltered. "You know him?" "He's mine." A pause. She folded her arms, eyeing him with suspicion. "Sir, I'm sorry, but this animal is under legal hold. He's evidence in an ongoing investigation. You can't claim him." "I'm not claiming," John said quietly. "I'm reuniting." Her tone shifted, firmer now. "Look, we've heard that before. Everyone wants a war hero dog these days. Some guy last week said the same thing about a pit bull with a limp. It doesn't work that way." John clenched his jaw. He'd faced down insurgents with rocket launchers and corrupt contractors with blood on their hands. But this bureaucratic indifference, It struck deeper than any shrapnel. He has a tattoo, under the belly, serial, D7441, USMC, scan. Linda sighed, pulled a small scanner from her belt and aimed it at Aegis's side. The beep came a second later. Her eyes narrowed. "Well, I'll be damned," she muttered. "I told you," John said, heart pounding. "They're forming a committee to oversee the new discharge protocols." John didn't open it, not right away. He looked at Aegis, who had laid his head on John's boot, eyes closed. "I'll think about it," Maria smiled. "That's more than I expected." Eli arrived a moment later holding 2 cups of coffee, one of which he handed to John. "They did good," he said, glancing back at the statue. John nodded. "Yeah, they did." A light breeze stirred the grass, and then something unexpected happened. Aegis lifted his head slowly and let out a soft, low bark. It wasn't loud. It wasn't sharp. Just a sound of recognition. Across the field, another dog approached, a golden retriever in a vest, leading a man with dark glasses and a folded cane. The dog wagged once, then paused beside the statue, and for a moment the 2 dogs stared at each other. No leash could have held the moment tighter. It was quiet, profound, and when it passed, Aegis laid his head back down, as if to say, "We're home now. We've done enough." John leaned back against the tree, sipping the coffee, the letter still unopened in his lap. The war had taken many things from him, but in this place, in this moment, under this sky, he found something greater than what had been lost. He found peace. The seasons shifted slowly in Virginia. Autumn had begun to stretch its fingers across the hills, leaving the trees tinged with gold and fire. The fields around John's farmhouse turned brittle and brown. Leaves gathered along the fence line, swirling in soft winds that carried the scent of pine and distant smoke. Inside, the house was warm, not just from the fire crackling in the stone hearth, but from something quieter, deeper. Aegis lay stretched out in front of it, eyes half closed, ears twitching with the sounds of the old house settling. Every now and then, he'd lift his head to track John's movements as he paced the floor, a piece of mail clutched in one hand. It was another request, an invitation to speak at a Veterans Policy Forum in Washington. His name had become symbolic in those circles now, not because he was a hero, but because he hadn't stopped fighting, because he'd made people listen. He didn't answer it. Not yet. He walked out onto the porch instead, where the rails had begun to fade to grey. The fields stretched out before him, quiet and untouched. Beyond them, the woods whispered like old friends. Behind him, Aegis pushed open the screen door with his nose and stepped outside, stiff but moving with the calm confidence of a dog who no longer had to fear what lay around the next corner. They stood together in silence for a while, watching. The sun began to set behind the trees. "I used to think we came back broken," John said softly, voice nearly lost in the wind. "That what we saw out there stayed with us so long it poisoned everything else." He reached down, rubbing the base of Aegis's neck. "But you didn't come back broken. You came back waiting for someone to remember you were still out there." Behind him the phone rang. He didn't move. Over the past few weeks, the Aegis project had grown faster than any of them expected. More volunteers had signed on, more dogs had been found, some still in government limbo, some in private kennels. Each time they found one, Maria wrote their name on a piece of parchment and pinned it to the barn wall. The wall had started with one name. Now it had 37, each name written in careful, blocky letters. No ranks, no call signs, just names. Tonight, John would add one more, not a rescue, a remembrance, a shepherd named Riker who hadn't made it out of a contractor's compound in Georgia. The man who'd handled him was now sitting in prison thanks to Micah's testimony. But the dog never got home. John slipped back inside and found the parchment, wrote Riker's name, and carried it to the barn. The air inside was cool, the beams heavy with the scent of hay and memory. He pinned the paper above the others and stepped back, hand resting lightly on the frame. "I'm sorry we didn't find you sooner," he whispered. Aegis waited by the door, watching. Later, they sat on the porch again, this time joined by Eli, who'd brought 2 cups of black coffee and a paper folded under his arm. "They passed it," Eli said, handing him the news. "Unanimous vote, mandatory reunification, all dogs now classified as veterans with full service benefits. It's done." John read the headline, then folded the paper and placed it beside him. "Not done," he said. "Not until they stop needing someone like me to fight for what should have been theirs all along." Eli nodded, understanding. Maria arrived just before dark, a tired smile on her face. She'd driven 2 hours to meet a family who'd just been reunited with their bomb-sniffing lab. The father was an army sergeant. The son, maybe 6, hadn't stopped hugging the dog's neck for 20 straight minutes. She didn't need to say it out loud. The story was written in the glow behind her eyes. The porch fell quiet again. The fireflies started blinking in the yard. The night took hold, soft and unthreatening. John leaned back in his chair. "You ever think we'd make it here?" Eli asked. "No," John said. "But I knew we had to try." Aegis stirred beside him, eyes still open, always watching. A dog that had been trained for war, broken by men who saw him as nothing more than a tool, found again by the one he'd never stopped waiting for, and now resting in peace, not because the world had changed, but because someone had refused to let it stay the same. John didn't speak again that night. He sat quietly, thinking of the years behind him, and the names on the wall, and the quiet roads still ahead. Not every battle ends in fire. Sometimes it ends in silence. Sometimes the victory is simply surviving long enough to choose what comes next. And for John Kramer, for Aegis, and for every dog and handler who'd ever fought in the shadows and been forgotten, this was the legacy they chose, to be remembered not for the wars they fought, but for the fight they won after the war ended, the fight for love, the fight for loyalty, the fight for each other. And that was enough. Was from a child whose father had served. She'd drawn a picture of a dog with big ears and a happy smile. Her note read, "Thank you for saving the hero who couldn't ask for help." John folded it carefully and looked down at Aegis, whose head rested on his knee. "You saved me first," he said. Aegis didn't move, just leaned in a little closer. The morning air was cold but still, the kind of stillness that invited reflection. John adjusted his tie slowly in the cracked mirror of the farmhouse's bathroom. He hadn't worn a suit in years, not since the funeral of his former commanding officer. The dark jacket felt tight across his shoulders, but the stiffness reminded him he was still alive, still capable of standing tall. Aegis sat patiently near the front door, already wearing his vest. The patch on his side read, "Retired Military Service Animal." Above it the flag, no rank, no medals, just the truth. They drove in silence, the truck winding through sleepy back roads, then onto the interstate. Maria and Eli followed behind in a separate vehicle, both dressed in black, their expressions solemn. There was no music, no chatter, just the hum of tires on pavement and the occasional click of Aegis's claws as he shifted in the seat beside John. It had taken months to get the memorial approved, years of fighting by other handlers before John ever entered the picture. But today was the day, the first national memorial dedicated to the war dogs of the United States military, to the K-9s who had served beside men and women and were too often forgotten the moment they were deemed non-essential. They arrived at Arlington just after sunrise. Rows of headstones stood in quiet formation, as if waiting for inspection. The site for the ceremony was set near the eastern end of the cemetery, where the grass rolled into the horizon and the morning light hit first. A small crowd had gathered. No cameras, no reporters. This wasn't for headlines. It was for those who knew. Veterans, handlers, families. Some wore uniforms, others held photos. One woman clutched a worn collar in both hands, her knuckles white with memory. The memorial. It stood simple and proud, a bronze sculpture of a soldier kneeling beside a Belgian Malinois, one hand on the dog's back, the other resting over his own heart. Their faces were turned toward each other, not in command, not in battle, but in understanding. An inscription beneath read, "Loyalty without condition, service without question." John stood a few feet from the statue, Aegis at his side, unmoving. The wind caught his coat gently, lifting the edge of his ear. He didn't bark, he didn't whimper, he just watched. When the officiant asked John to come forward, the silence deepened. John approached with slow, steady steps. No notes, no speech, just truth. He looked out over the crowd and then down at Aegis. "I'm not a man of big words," he began, "but I know what it means to trust something with your life. I know what it means to be protected by someone who couldn't speak your language, but understood you better than most people ever will." He paused, letting the wind fill the quiet. "This dog saved my life, not just in war, but after it. When everything else fell apart, he was still waiting, still fighting, and even after he was betrayed by the country he served, he never gave up. Not on me, not on himself." John knelt beside Aegis and unclipped the small wreath from his arm. A circle of laurel and cloth, hand-woven by a group of veterans' wives who had lost their own K9 partners in combat. He walked to the base of the statue and laid it gently, beneath the dog's bronze paws. Then he returned to his place beside Aegis and stood. That was all. No applause, no anthem, just stillness. And then, one by one, others came forward, a former Marine with a cane, a young woman with a prosthetic leg, an older man with trembling hands who whispered his dog's name into the wind and placed a photo beneath the sculpture. Aegis watched them all, unmoving, as if he understood this was not about him, but about all of them. When the ceremony ended, the crowd didn't disperse quickly. They lingered, talking quietly, sharing names, years, deployments. It wasn't just a tribute, it was a gathering of memory. John sat with Aegis beneath a tree overlooking the site. Maria eventually joined, him handing him a folded letter. "What's this?" he asked. "Another invitation," she said. "Congress wants you back." John lowered himself to the ground beside him and placed a hand gently on his back. "Yeah," he said softly. "We've earned that." There was a time John couldn't imagine coming back to this place. The back porch, the quiet hills rolling. Out toward the horizon, the way dusk wrapped the farmhouse in silence. After the war, after the loss, it had all felt too still, like something sacred had been drained from it. But now, with Aegis curled at his feet and the night insects humming in the tall grass, it felt alive again. Rebuilding wasn't fast. Not for Aegis, not for John. The scars were still there. Aegis flinched when the wind hit too hard, or when a door shut too fast. He slept with one eye open, even now. But the tail wagged a little easier each morning, and some nights he dreamed without growling. One morning, John opened the mailbox to find a thick envelope. Inside was a certificate from the Department of Defense. It named Aegis an honorably retired military service animal. Below it was a second letter, an official apology. John didn't frame it. He didn't need to. He slid it into a drawer beside his discharge papers. Let it rest with the others. Instead, he focused on something new. At Maria's urging, they began speaking at veteran centers. Not large events, just quiet rooms with quiet people. Handlers, families, soldiers. John never brought notes. He simply spoke. About trust, about loyalty, about a war dog who had saved his life and been forgotten by the country they both served. Sometimes, Aegis came too. He'd sit beside the podium, eyes soft, tail thumping slowly, when someone reached out. His presence did something words couldn't. It made the pain real. It made the healing feel possible. After one talk, a woman approached with tears in her eyes. She showed John a photo of a German shepherd named Brutus, who'd been retired and lost in the system. They'd tried to adopt him. Never got a call back. John took the information down. So did Maria. Within a week, they They tracked Brutus to a kennel. In Nevada, he was alive, unclaimed, and thanks to the new federal mandates pushed through by the bill John had helped inspire, he was released to his original handler. That became the pattern. One dog at a time. One handler. One story. Veterans who'd long buried their guilt now reached out, asking for help. Maria coordinated logistics, Eli organized the database, and John took the calls himself, sometimes just to listen, sometimes to cry. The word spread. News outlets called it the Aegis Project. John didn't like the name, but he didn't argue. What mattered was the mission. One evening, Eli pulled into the farmhouse with a van full of gear. Inside were 6 crates, all donated, some by shelters, others by veterans who no longer needed them. "We're not just helping one dog anymore," Eli said as they unloaded. "We're helping a generation of forgotten ones." John set up the crates in the old barn. Aegis watched from the hayloft, his tail swishing thoughtfully as John laid out blankets, water bowls, and tags. It didn't feel like charity. It felt like purpose. A few months in, they had their first foster, a Dutch shepherd. Named Luna, shaky, anxious, and terrified of loud voices. She didn't trust easily. She didn't eat for the first 2 days, but by the end of the week, she followed Aegis everywhere. By the end of the month, she was placed with a retired Navy medic who hadn't smiled in 2 years. That changed the day she leapt into his lap, without warning, and refused to move. John got the photo 2 weeks later, a man and his dog, both asleep in a recliner, arms and paws tangled. That one stayed on the fridge. The Pentagon sent word about expanding the program. Not funding, not oversight, just an acknowledgement and an offer. Would John consider serving as the program's national advisor? He declined. He wasn't interested in titles or bureaucracy. He told them he'd keep doing what he was doing, as long as they stayed out of the way. That would be enough. Still, they sent patches for the dogs, little flags, honor stripes. Aegis wore his on a new vest Maria had stitched together herself. It fit perfectly. One night, as the fire crackled low and the farmhouse went quiet, John sat on the floor with Aegis beside him, a stack of letters in his lap. Most were thank you notes. Some were from handlers, others from strangers. One, written in a careful looping script. "I think you've been waiting to hear from someone like me." John didn't speak. Aegis stood stiff beside him, silent, nose twitching. Micah looked down. "He remembers me." John's voice was flat. "Should he?" "I handled him," Micah said quietly. "During his time with the gang. After the contractor sold him off, I was hired muscle, private detail. I didn't know what they'd done to get him. Didn't care at the time." "Why now?" John asked. Micah looked him in the eye. "Because I didn't know who he was. And once I did, I couldn't forget it." John stepped aside without speaking. "Let him in." Micah moved slowly, eyes scanning. The house like a man stepping into church. Aegis didn't growl, didn't lunge. He just stared, ears flicking with tension, waiting. "He never turned on us," Micah said, once seated. "Even after everything. He obeyed commands. He worked. But he didn't trust us. Not really. One time he refused to go through a door I opened. Sat down and just stared at me. I thought it was stubbornness. Now I know it was something else." John sat across from him. "What are you here to do?" Micah reached into his jacket and pulled out a flash drive. "To testify, to show you what I have. There's footage of transfers, of handlers talking about the old dog from the war. There's paperwork too. I took it with me when I left. I've been sitting on it for months. Why not come forward before?" "Because I was a coward," Micah admitted. "Because I thought maybe it'd go away if I stayed quiet. But when I saw that video, him leaning into you like that, I knew it wasn't going away. And it shouldn't." John took the drive and turned it over in his fingers. It was nothing special, plastic, light, but it felt heavier than most things he'd carried. "There's a lot of names on there," Micah said. "Some still in the military, some in private firms. One of them, Cutter was running the field team that bought dogs like Aegis, treated them like gear. He knew exactly who he was when he signed off the paperwork. "You willing to testify under oath?" Micah nodded. "I'll do whatever it takes." That night, Maria and Eli reviewed the contents of the drive. It was more than they expected. Logs, audio files, footage from a hidden camera Micah had once placed inside a guard room during a contractor meeting. One clip showed a man flipping through a binder labeled "Live Assets, Retired Inventory." Aegis's photo was there. So were others. "This is it," Maria said. "This breaks it open." They prepared a submission for the federal investigators. Overseeing the inquiry sparked by Aegis's case, it was airtight: dates, names, chains of custody. It connected military discharge corruption to private security abuses and outlined a black market network of repurposed war dogs. And at the center was the truth everyone had been afraid to say aloud. These weren't just failures of paperwork. They were systemic, intentional, and criminal. When the footage leaked, the public backlash exploded again. Only this time, it didn't just demand justice for Aegis. It demanded justice for every dog who had disappeared into the void. Micah appeared in a closed-door session 3 days later. Under oath, he described the training compound, the orders. The Times handlers were told to push the dogs harder, to break their instincts. They told us if they hesitated, we had to reset them, rewire them, that we didn't need loyalty, just obedience. "And Aegis?" the investigator asked. "He never broke," Micah said. "He obeyed, yeah, but you could tell he remembered something better. He wasn't like the others." "And that's why you left?" Micah nodded. "Because I started wondering who I would have been in his place." The testimony made it into the next phase of the hearings. The drive was entered into official record, and the names started falling: Cutter, Rollins. 3 more former contractors, 1 DoD official who'd looked the other way. By week's end, indictments were drafted, and through it all, John stayed quiet. He didn't want interviews. He didn't want cameras. He just wanted to take Aegis on morning walks through the back pasture, let him roll in the grass, listen to the wind, smell the earth. One morning, Aegis stopped beside an old pine, sniffed the base, then sat down slowly and looked up. "At John, you want to rest?" John asked. Aegis didn't move, just sat there, peaceful. Snapped during the visit by an unseen hand. Aegis curled into John's chest, eyes half closed, muzzle resting against his former handler's heart. It hit the internet like a tidal wave. By morning, it had been shared over 2 million times. Veterans reposted it with hashtags like "Challenge Bring Him Home" and "No Soldier Left Behind." Animal rights groups demanded congressional hearings. Late-night hosts picked it up. Even retired generals commented. One post simply read, "This is why we serve. Give the man his dog." The shelter's silence turned to stone. They stopped answering calls. The director vanished from public view. A city councilwoman broke ranks and issued a statement live on local television. "What's happening is wrong," she said. "And I don't care what bureaucracy says. That dog deserves to go home." Even the judge noticed. A hearing was scheduled. Emergency session, no delays. In the courthouse lobby, John stood flanked by Maria and Eli, both now serving more as witnesses than allies. The room was filled with press and strangers and supporters, but he didn't speak. He didn't wave or smile. He just waited. Inside the courtroom, something unexpected happened. The shelter's legal team didn't show. Instead, a government attorney stepped in, Department of Defense seal on his briefcase. He looked tired, unsure. When the judge asked who he was representing, he answered plainly, "The interests of national security." John almost laughed, but he didn't. The judge narrowed her eyes. "Are you suggesting a former military dog constitutes a threat?" The attorney faltered. "I'm suggesting the transfer of classified assets must be handled carefully." Maria stood before the judge could respond. "Your Honor, The only classified thing here is the level of shame this country should feel for how it's treated this animal. Eli rose next, holding up a tablet with the video cued and ready. If the court will allow one more demonstration. The judge nodded. The screen lit up. It showed John standing in the visitation room, still and calm, as Aegis was led in on a leash. The moment the dog saw him, the leash went slack. A single command, at ease, and the dog sat instantly, then whimpered, then leaned forward. The judge watched it all. When the lights came back on, the silence was absolute. Then she spoke, quietly, but with finality. Effective immediately, I am ordering the return of K9 7441, Aegis, to the custody of Sergeant John Kramer. Furthermore, I'm opening a formal inquiry into the treatment and classification of all military working dogs post-service. John didn't smile. He didn't pump his fist or thank the press. He just sat down, hand trembling, the paper in front of him now stamped with the word that meant everything, approved. 3 hours later, they brought Aegis to him. No cameras, no handlers, no fences, just a quiet hallway and a simple gate. The dog came through slowly, eyes searching. Then he saw John and broke into a run. He hit John's chest with full weight, muzzle pushing against his neck, tail beating the air like a drum. There were no words, no speeches, just breath, just skin and fur, and the kind of silence that speaks louder than anything else. Maria stood back, wiping her eyes. Eli turned away, hiding the shake in his shoulders. It was done. Aegis was home. The first morning back, Aegis didn't sleep. Not really. He lay beside John's bed with one eye open, his body stiff, breath shallow. He didn't whine, didn't pace, just watched the door like an old sentinel return to duty when the sun crept through the blinds and lit the floor. In warm streaks, John stirred and looked down. Still on watch? He asked quietly. Aegis lifted his head and gave a soft huff, as if answering, I never stopped. John's farmhouse had seen better days, weathered siding, creaky steps, patches of grass that refused to grow. But it was theirs. And as Aegis limped across the wooden floor and eased himself down onto a threadbare rug by the fireplace, John knew one thing for sure. The house finally felt alive again. Maria arrived that afternoon with a bag of veterinary supplies and 2 large boxes of raw food. She knelt by Aegis and gently examined his shoulder. The scar was worse than she remembered. Old tissue, unhealed. She said nothing as she cleaned it. Her hands practiced, respectful. He needs more. In time than I thought, she said. This isn't just physical. John nodded. Neither am I. Eli followed with updates. The government inquiry had begun. A formal investigation into the treatment of military canines had been launched, and public pressure was mounting. The footage of John and Aegis had become a symbol, not just of reunion, but of failure. The nation had forgotten its 4-legged soldiers, and now it wanted to make amends. A week later, a bill was introduced in Congress, the Military Working Dog Recognition and Retirement Act. Simple on its surface, but powerful in impact. Mandatory retirement protocols for all war dogs, automatic reclassification as veterans, and most importantly, first right reunification with their handlers. The news broke during dinner. Maria read it aloud while John spooned stew into Aegis's bowl. They're calling it bipartisan, she said, almost in disbelief. The first one in years. John scratched behind Aegis's ear, feeling the thick fur twitch under his fingers. Maybe they're remembering what matters. It didn't take long for the invitations to come. News programs, morning talk shows, podcasts. But John declined most. He didn't want to talk about trauma. He didn't want to explain scars or politics. He wanted the country to see Aegis not as a victim, but as a veteran, a soldier. One invitation he didn't turn down came from the Pentagon itself, a closed-door session with defense leaders and congressional sponsors of the new bill. Maria insisted on going. Eli, too. They wore suits. John wore his old dress blues. He stood at the front of the room, Aegis by his side in a custom vest that bore no rank, only the American flag and the letters K97441. "I don't want a statue," John told them. "I don't want speeches. I want you to remember that loyalty doesn't end when the war does. You made promises. So did we. It's time both sides honored them." Silence followed, then a standing ovation. The next week, they were asked to appear via live stream for the bill's public hearing. John sat in front of a plain backdrop in his living room. Aegis lay at his feet, calm, alert. He told them about training in the desert, about the sound of Aegis barking through gunfire, about the night he thought he'd died and the years he spent thinking he had. Then he told them what it meant to be reunited, to fight, not with weapons, but with patience, persistence, and truth. By the time he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. When the hearing closed, the camera stayed on for a moment too long. Viewers caught a glimpse of Aegis lifting his head and pressing it gently against John's leg. The image became the face of the bill. It passed with overwhelming support. Soon after, the Department of Defense issued a formal statement of apology to all military dog handlers affected by previous discharge protocols. It wasn't perfect, it didn't undo the pain, but it was something. A month later, John received a letter, embossed seal. Heavy stock. Inside was an invitation. "You are cordially invited to attend the dedication of the National War Dog Memorial in Arlington National Cemetery." John stared at it for a long time. Then he folded it carefully and slid it into the breast pocket of his jacket. The day of the event, he and Aegis arrived in silence. The grounds were immaculate, rows of white stones stretching out like quiet soldiers. The ceremony was small, reserved, veterans, families, lawmakers. At the center stood a bronze statue, life-sized, of a soldier kneeling beside a dog, their heads bowed toward each other. There were speeches, a reading of names, a moment of silence. Then John stepped forward. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply placed a single wreath at the base of the statue. Then he looked at Aegis, who stood at attention beside him, tail still, eyes calm. In that moment, they weren't just a man and a dog. They were brothers, and they were home. The first knock came just after dusk. John had just stepped off the back porch, his hands dusted with dirt from the garden. Aegis followed him everywhere now, his limp less pronounced, his coat thicker, fuller. They were rebuilding together, one slow day at a time. When John opened the door, he didn't recognize the man at first. Late 30s. Sun-dark skin, a shaved head, broad shoulders beneath a faded utility jacket. He held his cap in both hands. Like he wasn't sure whether he had the right to wear it. "Mr. Kramer?" the man asked. "Yeah, my name is Micah Vance." Rollins simply shut the door. Cowardice doesn't slam like thunder. It clicks softly, quietly, and that door clicked. Back in town, the shelter director finally broke her silence. Not in a press conference, but in a leaked internal memo. "I was following protocol," she'd written. "I was told the dog was classified. I didn't know the full background until the footage surfaced. By then, the animal had already been transferred." She claimed ignorance. She begged for anonymity. But the public wasn't interested in apologies. They wanted justice. The very next morning, John received a phone call. Unknown number, a gruff voice on the line. "This is Sergeant Blake. I was Aegis's primary trainer before he was deployed. I thought he'd died in Kandahar." John's breath caught. "He didn't. I know that now, and I'm sorry. I should have followed up. Should have asked questions. I'd like to testify if this goes to court." John nodded slowly. "We'll take all the help we can get." Maria entered moments later, her face pale. "You're going to want to sit down." She handed John a printed email. Top line, confidential, classified transfer request. The facility where Aegis had been sent, the off-grid kennel guarded like a military outpost, was listed under the Department of Homeland Security. And the directive, buried in bureaucratic language, detailed an intended behavioral reprogramming protocol meant to repurpose former military canines for private security operations abroad. It wasn't just Aegis, there were dozens. They were rebuilding them, Maria said, voice hollow, conditioning them, dogs with combat experience, repurposed and sold. Eli looked sick. That's black market merc work. These weren't shelters. They were labs. John sat in silence. How long? We don't know, Maria answered. But this isn't just about getting Aegis home anymore. It's about tearing this down. Late that night, John received permission, reluctantly, to visit Aegis under supervision. 1 hour, no cameras, no press, one handler in the room. No touching without clearance. It was the first break they'd given him. He drove there in silence, every mile a knot in his chest. The building was colder than he expected. Concrete walls, sterile smell, a front desk that barely looked up when he arrived. They took him down a hallway, unlocked 3 doors, then gestured toward a room with a single window. Aegis was inside. He stood in the corner, leaner than before, fur matted in patches, one eye swollen from a healing injury. John entered. Slowly, Aegis, he whispered. The dog turned, hesitated, and then something shifted. His tail gave a single twitch, his ears lifted, and then he moved, not a lunge, not a leap, a slow, steady walk. John knelt, and Aegis, broken, betrayed but not defeated, collapsed into his arms and let out a low, trembling whine. The handler at the door said nothing, didn't move, just turned away. When John left that room, he didn't cry. Not then, but something had broken open inside him, a wound 5 years deep, and now, for the first time, it had a chance to heal. The echo of Aegis's whine lingered with John long after the door closed behind him. It wasn't just a sound. It was a memory pulling itself out of the fog. That noise, soft and cracked with pain, was the same one he'd heard in the tent outside Kandahar after they'd been ambushed. The dog had crawled across broken stone to reach him then. And now, 5 years later, across a cage and a war of paper and silence, Aegis had crawled back again. The visit had been brief, exactly 58 minutes, timed to the second. No touching, they said, but the moment Aegis pressed his head into John's chest, no one moved to stop it. The handler stayed quiet, eyes down. Even he couldn't interrupt that kind of reunion. It wasn't protocol anymore. It was human. Maria was waiting in the parking lot. Her phone buzzed in her hand, another media outlet requesting interviews. The story had gone viral. Again. But when she saw John's face, she didn't ask. She didn't speak at all. She simply opened the door, and John climbed into the passenger seat like a man who had just climbed out of a grave. "He knew me," he finally said, staring out the window. "He came right to me." Maria didn't speak. He was limping, still. "Has that cut on his left shoulder? He's too thin, but he's in there." That night they released the photo, a single image. Works in animal control licensing. She's seen movement like this before. If they're hiding a military K9, they'll need to bury it under layers of paper. We just need to dig through them. 2 days passed. Rain fell in sheets. And the motel. Walls felt tighter with each hour. Then Maria's contact came through. A small, hastily scanned document, transfer authorization, signed and sealed. Not to a shelter, not even a holding center, but to a special protection asset hub, registered under a private security group based outside Alexandria. The company. Another shell, linked to the same umbrella group Rollins had been tied to. "They're warehousing dogs," Maria said, scrolling through the facility's sparse public listings. "High-value assets, most never get adopted. No photos, no names. Prison," Eli muttered, "for dogs." The next night, John drove there. He didn't go inside. He just parked, across the road, and watched. Tall fences, barbed wire, a guard post with one man, maybe two. No signage, no markings, just the kind of place that didn't want to be seen. Aegis was inside. He could feel it. He sat there for hours, rain pelting the windshield, engine off. At some point, a floodlight swept over the road, paused on his truck for a beat too long, then moved on. That was when he knew. They knew he was there. He left before the confrontation came. But the rage simmered just beneath the surface now, deeper than frustration, deeper than grief. It wasn't just about Aegis anymore. It was about the truth they were trying to erase. The next morning, they made it public. Maria compiled the documents. Transfer logs, shelter footage, the chain of custody, everything. Eli uploaded the photo of Aegis in chains. They titled it with a single line, America's Forgotten Soldier. The post went live on every major veteran forum, whistleblower site, and military advocacy channel they could reach. Within an hour, it had over 10,000 shares. By evening, the shelter's phone lines were swamped. The director released a statement calling it a misunderstanding. But John knew better. 2 nights later, a message was left under their door. A printed threat, no signature. You're endangering a national asset. Step back before others get hurt. John stared at the words, then quietly folded the paper and placed it in a box with the others. They still think this will scare me, he said. Maria looked up. Will it? No, he said simply, because I know where he is. He paused, voice low, steady. And I'm going to get him out. The storm broke just after dawn, not the kind with thunder or rain, but the kind made of fury, headlines and cameras. By mid-morning, national news outlets were replaying the same footage on repeat. A grainy video of a Belgian Malinois barking, chained to a steel post, eyes wild with recognition. The headline read, Forgotten Hero, War Dog imprisoned in legal limbo. And then came the wave. First, it was veterans, handlers, infantry, medics, sharing stories, photos, calling out politicians by name. Then animal rights activists. Then the families of fallen soldiers. One by one, they rallied behind a dog most of them had never met, not because of his breed, not because of his scars, but because they saw something they recognized in Aegis, loyalty betrayed. By noon, the story had reached Capitol Hill. John stood in the motel room watching the screen as Congressman Walton, a retired Navy officer, gave a live statement. If we're going to talk about supporting our troops, we need to mean all of them. That includes the ones who walked on 4 legs and bled beside our sons and daughters. This story, it isn't just heartbreaking, it's a disgrace. And we're going to fix it. Maria muted the television. They've been calling all morning, she said, holding up her phone. CNN, MSNBC, even a podcast from some guy who used to train shepherds for Hollywood. John's gaze didn't leave the screen. I don't want their sympathy, he said. I want Aegis back. You'll get him, Maria said. But now we've got something bigger, pressure. That afternoon, a subpoena was issued for Colonel Rollins, the man who'd built the chain, the one who'd marked Aegis as excess, the one whose initials authorized the transfer to private contractors. He hadn't been seen in public in over a year, and now the cameras were camped outside his Virginia estate. When a reporter shouted a question about the dogs, we served 4 tours together. He saved my life twice. I thought he died in an ambush. I mourned him. And then, 5 years later, I walk into a shelter and find him chained behind steel. The city attorney shifted in his chair. Your Honor, emotional testimony. Quiet, the judge said without looking at him. Mr. Kramer, continue. I've submitted his military ID, tattoo registry, training history and field reports, John continued. He recognizes me, responds to commands. He's the same dog, just broken. Maria stood next. She handed over transfer logs, internal memos, and the whistleblower's letter, each one connecting the dots from the military to private contractors and eventually to the gang that used Aegis as a weapon. She spoke clearly, methodically. The military declared him unfit and then sold him, not to a family, not to a kennel, to a private security outfit that knowingly leased him to criminal groups. Eli followed, quiet but resolute. He played the footage on the projector, a grainy clip of John kneeling outside the shelter, giving a command in Pashto. Aegis obeyed immediately, then cried. This isn't a pet, Eli said. This is a veteran suffering because the system forgot him. The courtroom was silent. Then the city attorney rose. His smile was thinner now. Your Honor, with all due respect, this is a courtroom, not a therapy session. The dog is part of an active case. Our office has no objection to Mr. Kramer's past, but that does not grant him custody. Maria rose before the judge could respond. We have something else. She nodded at Eli, who stepped forward and handed the judge an unsealed manila envelope. Inside was the blurry photo they'd received, the one showing Aegis chained in a new facility, muzzle tight, coat dirty. John spoke again. They moved him after we filed this petition. No legal record, no facility name, just a message. Stop fighting. That's not procedure. That's kidnapping. The judge looked at the photo for a long time. Then she turned to the city attorney. Can you tell me where the dog is now? The attorney hesitated. No, he admitted. The judge stared at him, her face unreadable. Then she leaned back in her chair and steepled her fingers. I'll need time to review all submitted documents. This hearing is adjourned until further. Notice, Mr. Kramer, your petition is not dismissed. John nodded slowly. It wasn't victory, but it wasn't defeat either. As they stood to leave, a clerk handed Maria a sealed envelope. No return address, the woman said. It was dropped off during recess. Maria opened it in the hallway. Inside was a document, a facility invoice. It listed an animal transfer, date 2 days ago. Location, private holding, no public registry. Code, asset 7441, special handling requested. At the bottom, authorized by G. Rollins. John stared at the paper, his hands tightening. They're not hiding anymore, he said. No, Maria replied. They're warning us. Outside, the rain had started to fall, but John didn't flinch. He just looked up at the clouds and said, Good, let them come. The first thing John noticed in the photo, beyond the muzzle, beyond the grime clinging to Aegis's coat, was the eyes. Still the same, but dimmed. Hollow. There was a flicker of the soldier he'd known, buried beneath exhaustion and betrayal. And now, somewhere behind closed gates, Aegis was chained again, taken without cause, hidden like a secret too dangerous to let breathe. The envelope had no sender. The photo had no timestamp. The message was clear. They'd moved him, and they weren't planning to let him back. Maria scanned the invoice a dozen times. It's a private facility, no public access, no inspections. If this is real, they buried him so deep he might as well be gone. Eli leaned against the motel dresser, arms crossed, his expression grim. They're not even pretending anymore. This isn't about legality. This is about power. They're daring us to come after him. John didn't say anything. He stood at the window, staring out into the darkness beyond the parking lot. Every instinct from his time in the Marines told him the same thing. This wasn't a transfer, it was a disappearance. They'd stolen Aegis to make him vanish quietly, one more loose end tied off before anyone noticed. He turned from the window. We find him! No more waiting, no more paperwork, we find him! Maria nodded. I've got someone who might help. Whispered command, Aegis obeying instantly, sitting, lifting a paw, then whining when John didn't move closer. Erin watched in silence. Then she looked up at John. Is he still in there? John nodded. For now. She closed the folder and slipped it into her bag. I'll run the story, but be prepared, this will get messy. You're going to get pressure, maybe threats. We already have, Eli muttered. Then it's working, she said, standing. Keep your heads down, and don't give them a reason to shut you out. As she left, Maria's phone buzzed. Unknown number, she answered. A pause, then a static-laced voice. You think this is about a dog, it said. This is about control, and you just stepped into a war you don't understand. Then the line went dead. That night, John returned to the shelter, not to go inside, but to sit in his truck across the street, watching, waiting. Aegis hadn't been walked in 3 days. He could tell. The dog's movements, when he was briefly brought to the yard, were slow. He limped more now. Pacing had worn a raw line into the gravel near the fence. John picked up his camera and began to film. Every minute, every limp, every time Aegis sat down and whimpered. Inside the shelter, staff looked tense, whispers behind glass walls, closed-door meetings. At one point, two unfamiliar men in suits arrived and disappeared into the director's office. "They're panicking," Maria said the next day. "And if they're panicking, it means the story is burning through whatever wall they had up." That afternoon, the shelter released a statement. It was short, sterile, acknowledging concerns regarding one canine in our care and assuring full compliance with all legal and ethical guidelines. No mention of Aegis, no mention of John. But the silence told the truth. The shelter was under siege, and they knew it. The final move came that evening. John returned to his motel room to find an envelope slid under the door. Inside was a photo, blurry grayscale, but unmistakable, Aegis chained, muzzled, in a new kennel somewhere else. No markings, no timestamp, just a note scribbled in block letters. "This is what happens when you push too far." John stood frozen, the photo in one hand, the paper in the other. His chest rose and fell in shallow, slow breaths. Eli was already dialing Maria. "They moved him," he said. "They moved him again." John didn't speak, not for a long time. Then finally, in a low, quiet voice, he said, "They stole him. Again. And now it was war." The courthouse smelled like old wood and rain. Thunder rolled in the distance, muffled by the thick walls and arched ceilings, but the tension inside was sharper than any storm. John sat alone at the front of the courtroom, hands folded tightly on the table, a stack of documents beside him. He wore a dark jacket, pressed shirt, and the kind of solemn focus that belonged more in a battlefield than a municipal court. Maria and Eli sat behind him, silent but steady. Maria's laptop was open, screen dimmed, files queued. Eli held a thumb drive tight in his palm, eyes fixed ahead. It wasn't just a hearing, it was a line in the sand. The judge entered promptly at 9. Grey hair, clear eyes, a reputation for formality and cold logic. She didn't glance at the audience, only the docket as she sat. Petitioner John Kramer. Motion: transfer of custody for animal identified as Belgian Malinois, formerly designated K97441. The city attorney rose, a tall man in a grey suit with a hollow voice and sharper smile. "Your Honor, the city moves to dismiss the petition. The animal in question remains classified as state evidence tied to an active criminal investigation. We acknowledge Mr. Kramer's prior military connection, but deny any legal claim under current statutes." The judge looked at John. "You understand what you're asking the court to do?" "Yes, Your Honor," he said. "I'm asking the court to do what the system hasn't. Recognize that the dog you're calling evidence is a soldier, a veteran, my partner." She gave a curt nod. "Proceed." John stood. He didn't read a prepared speech. He didn't quote statutes. Instead, he pulled a photo from his folder and handed it to the bailiff. It made its way to the bench. A young Marine, dusty uniform, kneeling beside a bright-eyed Malinois. Both wore service tags. "That was Kandahar 5 years ago," John said. "That's Aegis, the dog you've got listed as evidence. Or it would have, if not for the email Maria found buried in a backup folder from a now-defunct contractor server. It was short, casual, dated 2 years prior. Dog solid, handles heat, got a scar on his left flank, but it doesn't slow. Him, the soldier who owned him, probably thinks he's dead, makes it cleaner this way." The message was signed with a call sign, G. Rollins. John stared at the page for a long time. Then he turned and walked out of the room, the door shutting behind him harder than necessary. Outside, he stood on the motel balcony, gripping the railing until his knuckles whitened. For 5 years, he'd believed the worst had already happened, But the real betrayal wasn't the loss. It was the silence, the lie, the deliberate erasure of a bond that was supposed to outlast war. Inside, Eli paced. This isn't just a screw-up. This is organized, intentional. They used war dogs, broke them, then dumped them into criminal hands. Maria nodded, and Rollins profited off every transfer. We can nail him, Eli said. This email? This is enough to bury him. Maybe, Maria said cautiously, but he's got protection. These guys don't fall alone. John stepped back inside, face hardened. Then we make noise. The next hours passed in a blur. Eli drafted a public dossier. Maria compiled the transfer logs, redacted identities, and mapped connections. John recorded a statement, a direct appeal, speaking about Aegis, the missions they shared, the night they were ambushed. He didn't cry. He didn't raise his voice. He just told the truth. And when it was done, they hit publish. The report went live on a secure whistleblower platform. Anonymous, immutable. They tagged every major journalist who covered defense scandals, every watchdog group, every veteran advocacy page. Within hours, it began to spread. Then came the email from a burner address. You're digging in the wrong grave. Drop it, before it buries you. No name, no trace, but the message was clear that the war wasn't behind them anymore. It had followed them home. The motel room was darker than usual, the single desk lamp casting long shadows across the wall. Maria sat cross-legged on the bed, the glow of her laptop illuminating her tired face. Eli stood by the window, peeking through the blinds every few minutes, his fingers tapping a nervous rhythm against the sill. John, silent, sat at the table, a pen in his hand, filling out one last piece of paperwork, his final custody petition for Aegis. This one's different, Maria said. We've got federal-level exposure now. Once the press catches wind of the full story, the shelter won't be able to hide behind legal technicalities. Eli turned from the window, holding his phone. And we're gaining traction. The thread's been reposted over 5,000 times. A few journalists are asking for interviews already. John didn't answer. He looked at the form in front of him, the dry language of bureaucracy, asking him to reduce his bond with Aegis into checkboxes and character counts. Name of dog, relationship to claimant, proof of ownership, current location. He filled it in slowly, deliberately. When he got to the last line, reason for petition, he stopped. His hand hovered above the paper. Maria looked over. What are you going to write? John set the pen down and stared at the words. Because he saved my life, and now it's my turn. The next day, he hand-delivered the petition to the city clerk's office. They didn't look him in the eye. One woman whispered to her colleague as she stamped the intake form. Another glanced down at the file with a flicker of unease. Word had spread, and so had the fear that something bigger was unraveling. Meanwhile, Maria was setting up the meeting with the reporter. Her contact, a seasoned journalist named Erin Tate, had been covering government overreach for 2 decades. She didn't scare easy. They met her at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. Erin wore a dark blazer, glasses perched on the edge of her nose, and the expression of someone who'd already seen the worst and come out standing. You have about 15 minutes before someone realizes I'm here, she said without greeting. Let's get to it. Maria laid out the files, the transfer logs, the email, the footage of Aegis from the gang's compound, and finally the video of John and Aegis, just 2 minutes long, recorded through the bars of the shelter's gate. John giving a single... They drafted a letter, a formal petition to reclassify Aegis not as a seized animal, but as a retired service member. They included testimony, documents, behavioral analysis, and a psychological evaluation by a military therapist who'd agreed to write a review based on the footage alone. The letter would go to the city council, the mayor's office, and the state's animal welfare board. But the most important piece wasn't paper. It was people. They started building a quiet network. Veterans, handlers, journalists, even a few celebrities who'd adopted former military dogs. Maria compiled statements of support. Eli started a protected forum to collect anonymous whistleblower messages. And John, he kept watching the shelter. One evening, parked across the street, he saw something that turned his stomach. Aegis being led out back, escorted by two handlers in civilian clothes, not shelter employees. The dog limped as he walked, his head low, tail unmoving. The man holding the leash spoke into a walkie, nodded, then yanked the dog forward when he hesitated. John recorded every second. Back at the apartment, they reviewed the footage in silence. The stillness was different now. Not waiting, but building. Pressure, heat, focus. They weren't guessing anymore. They were closing in. The phone rang early the next morning. John had barely slept, a mixture of anticipation and anxiety keeping him up as he watched the walls of the motel room close in. He picked up the receiver without checking the number, his thumb tapping lightly against the cool plastic. "Yeah?" His voice was rough, unused to the quiet. "It's Maria," she said, sounding tense, her voice lower than usual. "We've got a problem." John's heart skipped a beat. "What happened?" "They know," Maria replied. "I don't know how, but the shelter's director was tipped off. She got a call early this morning from someone high up. Told her we've been investigating. They're not going to wait for the courts anymore. They're moving Aegis." A cold knot twisted in John's stomach. "Where?" "I don't know. But they've been bringing in reinforcements. That's not a good sign." He sat up in the bed, already halfway to his boots. "Do you think they're moving him to another facility?" "It's possible," Maria said. "But the bigger issue is that someone is covering for them now. This isn't just the shelter anymore. Someone powerful is pulling strings." John gripped the edge of the table, his mind already racing with the possibilities. The last time Aegis had been moved, it had been from one corner of the world to another, cut off from the people who cared for him, turned into nothing more. Then a piece of equipment, a tool. "Stay on it, Maria. I'm going back there." When he arrived at the shelter, the energy was different. The parking lot was emptier than usual, fewer cars, less noise, but something in the air told him that the tension wasn't over. It was just beginning. John parked his truck 2 blocks down the street and walked the rest of the way, keeping his back straight and his steps measured. He needed to blend in, disappear. Through the chain-link fence, he saw the shelter staff moving with unusual urgency, carrying supplies into the back and locking doors with unnecessary force. Something was off. Something was wrong. He moved quickly, slipping behind the row of storage sheds, staying low against the wall of the building. There was an open window on the side, and he used it as an opportunity to slip inside unnoticed. The smell of bleach and disinfectant filled his nostrils, and the usual murmur of barking dogs was eerily absent. It was too quiet, too still. He crouched in the hallway, listening. Every instinct told him to leave before things escalated, but he couldn't. Not now. Not when he was this close. The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor. John pressed himself into the shadow of an alcove. 2 men walked past, their faces obscured by dark sunglasses. They weren't shelter staff, but they weren't cops either. They were too composed, too deliberate in their actions. John didn't need to see their uniforms to know that these men were bad news. They passed without noticing him. He waited until they were out of sight, then moved forward, keeping close to the walls. When he reached the back office, he heard muffled voices. One of them was the shelter's director. The other was deep, male, and commanding. John recognized the tone. It was the voice of someone who had been in control for a long time, someone who didn't care much for the rules. John pressed his ear to the door, straining to catch every word. "I don't care about the press," the deep voice said. "I don't care what you think you've got on us. What I do care about is making sure this goes smoothly. No one needs to know about this, understand? The dog is our asset. We've already moved him once. If you screw this up, you'll never see a dime from this deal. Do we have a problem?" There was a long silence before the director's voice came back, shaky but controlled. No problem. Just make sure it's done quietly. Done quietly. That was the last thing they wanted. John's blood ran cold. He couldn't let Aegis get moved again. Not again. He backed away from the door, retreating into the shadows. His mind raced with options, but he didn't have time to think. He needed a plan, and fast. Outside, the situation was escalating. He saw more unfamiliar cars arriving, black sedans, one after another, all parking close to the rear of the building. People stepped out in suits, talking on phones, their movements calculated. They weren't here for a simple transfer. This was a setup, a cover-up. The magnitude of what was happening hit John harder than anything he had faced before. These people weren't going to let him just walk out with Aegis. They were going to bury the truth. He pulled out his phone and dialed Maria's number. The line rang twice before she picked up. "They know," he said urgently. "They're moving him again. There's a group of men here, and it's not just the shelter staff. I don't know who they are, but this is bigger than I thought. We need to move." "What do you need from me?" Maria asked, her voice steady. "Start contacting your people. I need eyes on the back exit. Eli, too. We can't let them take him. We'll have to stop them ourselves." "I'm on it," Maria replied, and then hung up. John stood outside the shelter, watching the front doors open and close, watching the men file in, one by one. The urgency in the air was suffocating. They were closing in, running out of time. With a deep breath, John knew what he had to do. He had one chance. Just one. And it was now or never. The file was buried in a military archive under an innocuous title, K9 Disposition Reports, Non-Operational Assets. Maria had spent 2 hours navigating layers of digital firewalls, her private security, clearance barely holding against the archive's stubborn gatekeeping. But what she found wasn't just a record, it was a roadmap of corruption. She printed the document in silence, the steady churn of the machine sounding louder than ever. John stood beside her, his arms folded tight across his chest as the pages landed one by one on the desk. The heading was stamped in red, Asset Disposition Classified Priority. Beneath that were line after line of data, names, serial numbers, K9 units, statuses. Some were marked honorable discharge, others medical retirement. But a growing number had the same coded designation, Disposition, Section 9B Red. There were over 40 entries in total. One name stood out like a scar, Aegis, K9 7441. Status transferred, private contract. Rollins, G. John leaned closer. "Rollins," Maria nodded. "Retired Colonel Gregory Rollins. He was head of K9 operations for special deployments until 5 years ago. Took early retirement after a conflict of interest investigation that went nowhere." Eli whistled softly, joining them. "So he started selling off dogs like they were equipment." "Not just selling," Maria said. "Leasing, contracting. These were dogs declared too aggressive or unfit for civilian adoption, but that was just the cover. They funneled them into private security firms, many with defense contracts, and worse, some with criminal ties." John's voice was low and bitter. "So they lied about Aegis being lost in the ambush, lied about him being unfit." "They didn't lose him," Maria said. "They sold him. And Aegis wasn't the only one. The files traced the network. Military clearance routed through Rollins's office, then off-the-books transfers to Security Solutions Group, which operated under several shell companies. One of those companies had direct ties to known gang activity in Baltimore. That's where the trail ended. But to observe, he parked down the block and watched the staff rotate shifts. He saw the director's car arrive. He noticed the way the security cameras were recently upgraded. They were preparing for trouble, which meant they knew exactly what. They were hiding. He waited until a shift change, then walked to the sidewalk near the entrance. Just as the door opened, he caught a glimpse inside. For a fraction of a second, through the hallway window, he saw Aegis, sitting, watching, Still. "Chained!" he called softly, not loud enough to raise alarm. "Aegis!" The dog twitched. Their eyes met, and then Aegis rose, slow and uncertain, as if his muscles no longer trusted memory. His ears lifted slightly. His body leaned forward. Then came the soft, broken whine. The sound of a soul remembering its place. A staff member slammed the door shut. John didn't move. He just whispered, "I'm still here." Then he turned and walked away. The sun was going down, casting long shadows across the sidewalk, and somewhere behind a locked door, a war hero cried. They gathered at Maria's apartment just after sunset. No lights on, no blinds open, no electronics recording. Phones were powered off and stashed in a kitchen drawer. Old habits from old missions. John paced the room like he used to pace the perimeter, slow and focused, eyes scanning for threats that no one else could see. Eli sat cross-legged on the floor with a notepad and 3 Sharpies, circling names, underlining dates. Maria stood at the kitchen counter with a burner laptop, typing faster than she spoke. Every few seconds, she'd pause and listen, as if waiting for the walls to breathe back a warning. The air was heavy with old instinct and new anger. "Whistleblower's going quiet," Eli said, not looking up. "Too much heat. He won't speak publicly." "He doesn't need to," John replied. "We have the files, we have the footage, and we're not alone anymore." Maria turned the laptop around to show them an email thread. "I reached out to Erin Tate. Remember her? Reporter from DC, John said. She's been trying to crack the War Dog transfer issue for 3 years. I sent her the clean version. Of the video, minus identifiers. She's interested." Eli leaned forward. "We're not just going to leak it, right? If we go too fast, we lose control." "No," John said. "We do this right. We do it smart." They laid the plan out in silence. Eli would reach out to another whistleblower, someone from the contractor side, someone who knew how the dogs were classified as unfit, even when they weren't. Maria would track the paper trail on the retired Colonel Rollins, who'd greenlit the transfer programs. Meanwhile, John would return to the shelter and document everything. Conversations, behavior patterns, signs of stress in Aegis. A timeline that proved the state was complicit in his suffering. If they're going to treat him like property, Maria said, then we show how they've been abusing government property. "Think it'll work?" Eli asked. John stared out the window into the street, where headlights passed like slow-moving ghosts. "It has to." The next day, John returned to the shelter with a body camera hidden under his jacket. He acted calm, respectful, brought fresh documents to submit, even though he knew they'd be ignored. But this time, he recorded everything, the way the receptionist flinched when she saw him, how the staff whispered behind the glass wall, how the director avoided eye contact as she claimed she had no update on Aegis's status. "I just want to see him," John said softly. 5 minutes. "I'm sorry," she replied. "That's not allowed." "Why? He's part of an active investigation." "What investigation? No one will tell me. I'm not authorized to say." And that was recorded. Outside, John stood near the edge of the building, notebook in hand, pretending to jot notes while really watching the rear entry. A delivery truck pulled in. The driver spoke with the staff, handed over a box and left. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then, around midnight, Eli's contact sent them something new. The contractor behind the shelter's recent security upgrades was a subsidiary of Security Solutions Group, the same company that had handled Aegis after the military discharge. "They're protecting more than just a case," Maria said. "They're protecting the program," John added, "which means we're closer than we thought." That night, across the street in the shadows, it was past visiting hours, but he didn't care. He watched the dark building like a battlefield. Somewhere in there, behind steel and fluorescent light, was a soul he'd fought beside, a soul the world had thrown away. He remembered the night they'd been pinned down, bullets slicing through dust, the wind screaming louder than their radios. He'd taken cover behind a half-buried vehicle, bleeding from his leg. Aegis had stayed by his side, snarling, at every sound, refusing to leave even when ordered. When the medevac came, they had to pry the dog off of him. But now the same country that decorated John for bravery wouldn't let him see the one who saved his life. The next morning, Maria made calls to legal aid groups. Eli reached out to a veterans advocacy network. They gathered statements from other handlers, built a file thick with testimonies and precedent. But still, the answer came back the same. Not enough. Aegis remained behind bars. One morning, John received a call from the shelter's attorney. The voice on the other end was slick and emotionless. "We'd like to advise you to cease communication with the shelter and its staff. Continued attempts to access the dog will be considered harassment." He laughed bitterly. "Is that what you call trying to save a soldier?" "Sir, this conversation is being recorded." John hung up. They were turning the law against decency, turning silence into strategy, and every time John pushed, the wall grew taller, but he wasn't going to stop. Not now. The silence inside the motel room was heavy, the kind that crept into your chest and pressed against your ribs. John sat at the edge of the bed, a laptop open in front of him. The cursor blinked in the corner of the screen like a heartbeat. Maria sat beside him, her arms crossed, watching. The video file they'd just received, Eli had managed to reach a contact within Baltimore PD's internal archives. A whistleblower, someone who'd come across confiscated footage during a departmental review of the gang raid that had led to Aegis's seizure. It had taken weeks of quiet coordination, promises of anonymity, and the reassurance that this was about justice, not revenge. What they received in return was worse than anything they could have prepared for. The video opened with a grainy view of a concrete training space. It looked like a makeshift gym, mats stacked against the wall, a row of lockers dented and rusted. A man stood in the frame, muscular, shirtless, pacing back and forth like a coach preparing for a fight. Aegis sat in the corner, unmoving, head lowered, chained to the floor by a collar so thick it looked like it belonged in a prison. Then came the shouting, not commands, not structured training language, just noise, rage, threats, curses. The man struck the floor near Aegis with a baton, then hurled a hunk of raw meat toward the center of the room. Another man stepped in, dragging a smaller, terrified dog by the scruff. He tossed the animal in front of Aegis like bait. The screen jumped as someone adjusted the camera. Aegis remained frozen, muscles trembling. He didn't lunge. He didn't react until the man began shouting again, jabbing the baton near his side. Then, with a sudden motion, Aegis sprang forward, not toward the other dog, but the baton. He bit and twisted, deflecting the threat. The men laughed. They wanted blood. But Aegis resisted every push to become a weapon, until he couldn't anymore. Maria reached across and hit the spacebar, pausing the footage. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then, quietly, she asked, "How many hours of this do you think he lived through?" John's hands were fists in his lap. "Too many." Eli's voice came from behind them. He'd been standing in the doorway, holding a paper cup of motel coffee, untouched. They tried to turn him into something he wasn't. They failed, John said. Maria looked at him. "Did they?" John stood, his voice low. "No, not all the way. If they'd succeeded, he wouldn't have remembered me. He wouldn't have barked. He wouldn't have cried. They sent the video to their lawyer, sent copies to 2 advocacy groups. They uploaded a redacted version to a secure drive and sent a private link to a local journalist they trusted, someone who'd written about military dogs before. But they didn't go public yet, not until they had control over the story. Later that day, John returned to the shelter, not to confront. Maria took the file from his hand and skimmed the rest. This wasn't care, this was exploitation. He was sold like gear, trained again under stress conditions, then handed to a gang with enough money to call it security. Eli held up a camcorder found in another drawer. "This still works." They connected it to Maria's laptop. The screen flickered, and then came the footage. Grainy, but clear. A warehouse, concrete floors, shadows moving. And in the middle, a dog. Muzzled, chained, barking, snarling. A man off camera yelling commands, each one sharper than the last. When the dog lunged at a hanging dummy, the man cheered. When it hesitated, the screen shook from a sudden impact. A boot, maybe, or worse. The barking never stopped, just got louder, more desperate. John turned away before it ended. His throat burned. "That's Aegis," he whispered. Maria pressed pause. "They broke him," she said, "and then sold the pieces. They copied every file, every document, every second of video. They left the building as it had been, quiet, forgotten, poisoned." Back at the motel, John sat alone for a long time. He couldn't shake the image of Aegis, once proud and disciplined, reduced to something twisted and afraid. He thought of the mission that never ended, the oath that never expired. The way his team used to say, "No man left behind." But it hadn't applied to Aegis, had it? The moment he lost his usefulness, they'd stripped him of rank, of name, and of home. Not anymore. John picked up his phone. He called a contact from his old days, a lawyer who once helped him fight for VA care. He explained the files, the footage, the injustice. Then he said, "I want to file for custody. I want to bring my partner home." The lawyer was quiet, then answered with what John expected. "They'll block it, especially if the shelter's been looped into a legal case." "I figured," John said. "But if this video becomes public, if we show what they did, things might shift." "We're not there yet," John replied. "But we will be," Maria agreed. "One more link in the chain. That's all we need." They weren't just rescuing a dog anymore. They were exposing something much deeper, and someone was going to answer for it. The paperwork was thick, printed on stiff pages that smelled like toner and frustration. John handed the folder to the county clerk, watching her flip through the documents with a speed that made it clear she didn't care what any of it meant. It didn't matter that he had video proof, medical files, witness statements. In the eyes of the law, he was just a man trying to claim government property. "Mr. Kramer," she said flatly, "I see you've submitted a formal custody petition for a dog currently held under court seizure. I'm obligated to tell you that this case will likely be dismissed." "Why?" John asked. "Because the animal in question is considered active evidence in an open investigation," she said, not looking up. "Until that's resolved, no. Transfer of ownership can be processed." He clenched his jaw. "It's not ownership. He's my partner." She didn't flinch. "Legally, it makes no difference." John stared at her for a long time, feeling the weight of every door that had slammed in his face since the moment he walked into that shelter. No one wanted to take responsibility. No one wanted to admit what had happened. It was easier to hide behind legal definitions, easier to turn loyalty into logistics. He took the stamped copy of his petition and walked outside into the stale grey afternoon. Maria was waiting in the truck, hands on the wheel, eyes scanning the sidewalk. "No good?" she asked. "They're hiding behind procedures." She nodded, already expecting it. "The city attorney's not going to risk liability. If they admit Aegis was mishandled, it opens them up to lawsuits. So they'd rather leave him locked up. They'd rather bury him under paperwork until the public forgets." Back at the motel, Eli had set up a board on the wall, mapping connections. Military, bases, private contractors, legal departments, even animal control divisions. Red thread linked dots like arteries. At the center, a photo of Aegis, snapped from the shelter's intake form. The eyes were half closed, tired, worn down. John dropped the new files on the table. "They're stonewalling. Said I have no claim." "You have every claim," Eli muttered. "They're just too scared to let you win." That night, John stood outside the shelter again, a lie they'd used to declassify their existence. Aegis's number was on the list, next to a coded entry. Asset 7441, leased, OP, Black Garden. Black Garden wasn't a military code John recognized, but Maria did. "It's a placeholder," she said. Used when operations involve third-party hands, ones the government doesn't want on the books, usually overseas, but sometimes here. Next to Aegis's entry was a location tag from 3 years back, an address outside Baltimore. "That's where we start," Maria said. "I've got contacts who can help. We can't kick the front door in, but we can make noise." John pulled out an old flip phone he kept charged for emergencies. He hadn't called Eli again since their first talk. He didn't need to. The bond never required words. Still, when he heard the young man's voice on the other end, something like hope stirred in his chest. "Hey, you still in?" "You know." "I am," Eli said. "What's next?" They met at a cheap diner 2 hours later. Eli looked older than John remembered. He wore a hoodie, sunglasses, and the weight of 5 quiet years. His right hand trembled slightly when he reached for his coffee, a tremor John knew too well. But in his eyes, the fire hadn't gone out. "Got your message," Eli said. "So, it's real, all of it." "It's worse than we thought," Maria said, sliding the laptop toward him. He studied the logs in silence, then finally said, "You think the shelter knows?" John leaned back. "They're not just innocent caretakers. They flagged Aegis as aggressive and said nothing about his markings. They had to see the tattoo. They had to know. Then they're complicit," Eli muttered. John nodded. "Or scared. Either way, it didn't matter. What mattered was finding the chain, who took Aegis from the military, who sold him to the contractor, and how he ended up in a drug gang's kennel." Maria had already started mapping connections. The contractor had been owned in part by a former colonel, retired, well-connected. The same colonel who once oversaw K9 unit budgets for their division. "His name's Rollins," she said. "And he's not hiding. Teaches security seminars now, lives in a big house in Arlington." "We visit him?" Eli asked. "No," Maria replied. "We do better. We find his paper trail, and we hit them where it hurts." The rest of the day was spent digging. Maria had clearance access through an old consultancy gig. Eli knew people who monitored dark web sale points for ex-military gear, collars, vests, even tactical dogs. A sick world, underground, but profitable. They worked until the sun went down, and then some, building a trail that led them from the base in Kandahar to a military storage hub in Georgia, then to a contractor warehouse in Norfolk. That's where the trail got cold, but it was enough. John stood in his backyard late that night, under a sky so black it seemed to swallow the stars. He watched the dark horizon and thought about the promise he'd once whispered into Aegis's ear after their first mission together. "You and me, all the way, no matter where." He meant it then. He meant it more now. The trail to Norfolk led them to a forgotten building, with no name, no lights, and a rusted sign barely hanging above the dented gate. According to Maria's contact, it had once served as a contractor hub for Security Solutions Group, a staging point for assets moving between the military and private hands. John parked the truck just off the gravel path, headlights off, eyes scanning the shadows like he used to on night patrols. They didn't break in. They didn't have to. The place had been dead for over a year, but what remained inside told the story no one wanted written. Old crates labeled K9 Unit Retired, collars with chip tags, medical kits, some stained, a cabinet full of files, dusty but intact. Maria and Eli fanned out, searching for any mention of Aegis. John moved slow, methodical. He reached a metal drawer in the far corner. It squealed as he pulled it open, and what lay inside made his stomach drop. A folder, Asset 7441. Inside, a black and white photo, Aegis, younger, alert, his eyes bright but wary. Next to it, a page with typed lines that read like a transaction, not a transfer. Leased, Guardian Detail, Baltimore, 30 days with renewal clause. Return to handler optional. Behavioral modification protocol in effect. He stared at the term. Behavioral modification. They turned him into something else, he muttered. And John was going to fight for him. John didn't waste another hour. The moment he stepped back into his home, he pulled down a dusty box from the hall closet. Inside were the fragments of another life, uniform patches, Old letters, laminated, commendations, photos, and the last collar Aegis ever wore. John ran a finger over the nameplate. Still scratched, still his. If the shelter needed proof, he'd bring it. But this wasn't about documents anymore. This was about truth. And John knew the truth didn't die with paperwork. He started making calls. The military red tape had grown even thicker over the years, but he knew the back doors. He called Camp Pendleton first, where Aegis had been trained and deployed. He spoke to a clerk who said the dog had been declared MIA after the ambush, a term they didn't often use for animals. When he pushed further, the clerk transferred him. Twice. Finally, someone agreed to fax over Aegis's final deployment and incident reports. What John got didn't sit right. The documents showed that after the ambush, Aegis's tracking was discontinued, but the file was marked with an unusual clearance note: asset transferred. Non-military possession, section 14 red. That last line stuck with him. Red usually meant classified or worse, erased. He called Sergeant Maria Ortega next. She picked up on the first ring. "Kramer?" she said, surprised. "Jesus, I haven't heard that voice in years." John explained everything: the shelter, the barcode scan, the file. The silence on the other end was heavy. Then came Maria's voice, flat and cold. "I was told Aegis died that day." "So was I," John said. But Maria didn't sound shocked. She sounded angry. "Let me make a call," she said. "I know. Someone who still has access to base archives." Next was Eli Brooks. Private Brooks, they used to call him, the youngest in the unit. Back then he was reckless, wide-eyed, the kind who volunteered first and thought later. These days he was quieter, slower to speak. He listened as John told him what had happened. "I'll be damned," Eli murmured. "I never really believed they lost him." "Neither did I," John said. "I think someone sold him." That sentence came out like acid. He hadn't said it out loud before, but he'd felt it. The military silence, the weird redacted note. Aegis didn't just get lost. He was passed off, like spare gear. Eli didn't hesitate. "Whatever you need, I'm in." 2 days later, Maria called back. She'd used her clearance to dig deeper. Her voice was sharp when she spoke. "You were right. Aegis's file was altered. The transfer was internal, some kind of private contractor requisition. I traced it to a firm out of Virginia, Security Solutions Group. You know who else they handled? Who? Drug enforcement operations, including raids in Baltimore. The same raid your dog came out of." John's heart sank. "So it's all connected?" "Yeah," Maria said. "And it stinks." The picture was forming. Aegis wasn't lost in war. He was repurposed, recycled, passed from the military to private security, and eventually, somehow, into the hands of criminals, probably used for intimidation, protection, or worse. And through it all, no one raised a hand. No one even looked. John stood in his garage that night, staring at an old American flag folded in a triangle on the workbench. He remembered burying fellow Marines, remembered the silence of final salutes. Dogs like Aegis had no such ceremony, no folded flag, no tribute. But he was going to change that. He wasn't just going to bring Aegis home. He was going to expose the whole damn system that forgot what loyalty meant. Maria showed up 2 days later in a rented car, unannounced. She walked into John's driveway like she'd never left the battlefield, her stride firm and eyes sharp. John opened the garage door halfway through, fixing a busted hose on the truck, but the moment he saw her, the wrench dropped from his fingers. He hadn't realized until that second how much it meant, having someone from the old unit back on home soil standing beside him. She didn't say much, just nodded once, handed him a flash drive and said, "You need to see this." Inside, they sat at the dining table. The flash drive revealed more than John had dared to imagine. Internal logs from Security Solutions Group showed a list of canine assets transferred from military duty. Most were tagged as excess or unfit for service. "He's mine. Let me take him home." But Linda didn't budge. "I can't. The dog is part of a case file. The narcotics division flagged him. He's technically government property until the case clears. John stepped forward, the steel in his voice rising. That dog isn't property. He's a soldier, and he's mine. Voices from the back. Other shelter staff watching now. A few curious glances. One man shook his head. Another PTSD case, he whispered just loud enough. John heard it but didn't react. Aegis began to whine, low and mournful, then bark, then cry. The sound didn't echo, it pierced. Linda stepped between them. "Sir, please, you need to leave. You're upsetting him." "I'm not upsetting him," John said, eyes locked with the dog. "He remembers. That's pain, not fear." But it didn't matter. Linda pressed a button, and the kennel door automatically began to slide shut. Metal on metal. Aegis leapt to his feet, barking louder now, pushing his muzzle through the closing gap until it clamped shut with a thud. John stood still. So did the dog. Two souls, shattered by war, bound by loyalty, separated once again by the machinery of indifference. "I'll be back," John said softly. "I swear to you, I'm going to bring you home." Then he turned, walked past the others who were still whispering, still watching. He didn't look back. He didn't have to. Behind him, the howls of a forgotten hero echoed off concrete walls. John didn't sleep that night, not really. He sat at his kitchen table in the dark, staring at an old photo. Aegis sitting obediently at his side in front of a Humvee, dust and heat lines in the background. He traced the dog's silhouette with a trembling finger, remembering the feel of Aegis's fur, the warmth of his breath on those freezing Kandahar mornings, and the nights he kept John grounded when the silence got too loud. By morning, the decision was made. He didn't care what the shelter said. That dog was his, and no piece of paper, no court order, no bureaucrat in a cheap suit was going to tell him otherwise. The next day, he returned to the shelter with a file folder thick with documents, service records, deployment logs, photos, medical reports. He approached the front desk, his steps sure and quiet, like he was walking into a briefing room. Linda was there again. She sighed as she looked up. "I remember you," she said. "You should," John replied, setting the folder down. "You scanned his tattoo. You know I'm telling the truth. Now I'm here to prove it." She didn't open the folder. "It doesn't change anything. The dog is under legal hold." "Look at the records," he insisted. "This isn't some guess. That's not Maxwell. His name is Aegis, United States Marine Corps. We served together for 4 years. 2 combat tours." Linda still didn't move. John's voice lowered. "You saw the way he reacted to me. That wasn't confusion. That was recognition. Mr. Kramer, I believe you," she said finally. "But it doesn't matter. The situation is complicated." "Complicated," he repeated hollowly. "Is that what they call betrayal these days?" She shifted in her chair, uncomfortable. "The truth is, we didn't know what we had until the narcotics division flagged him. He was recovered from a drug operation in southeast Baltimore. The gang used him to guard their stash. He was aggressive, unstable. Frankly, we thought he was feral." John's fists clenched. "He wasn't unstable. He was abandoned. They left him behind." "The military left him behind," Linda softened slightly. "I understand you're upset, but the state claims custody. Until the investigation closes, there's nothing I can do." "What about visitation?" She looked at him like he'd asked. "To adopt a tiger." "It's not a child custody case, Mr. Kramer." He drew in a long breath, trying to hold back the storm building inside. "Yes," he said quietly. "It is." The conversation ended there. They wouldn't even let him see. Aegis, as he walked back to his truck, the weight of helplessness hit him harder than anything he'd felt since the war. It wasn't just the loss. It was knowing that after everything they'd been through, after all the blood, the nights, the pain, his best friend was now a forgotten casualty of paperwork and negligence. He sat behind the wheel, frozen, listening. The shelter was quiet behind the walls, but he could hear it, the faint, distant barking, not just noise, not just sound, a message. Aegis was still waiting.